Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Travis, and the name of the podcast is I Might Be Wrong. Thank you so much for joining me. If you get the time, you like the content, hit the subscribe button, share it with a friend, whatever else. You know what to do. All of these things help me grow the show. All right, let's get started. I think that most people think that the message of Christianity is nothing more than how to get to heaven. But I don't think that's really where it starts. And that's really going to be the purpose of this episode, because I think it starts with something that's far more disruptive, actually, and that is the reality that God became human. Not just temporarily, not symbolically, not as an idea, but truly he became human. In John's gospel, he articulates very clearly, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The angel who speaks and says what he is to be named says, you will call him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And I might be wrong, but I think that we've heard this so many times that we've stopped really feeling the weight of it. Because if God truly became human, then that changes not just how we see God, it changes what it means to be human. It changes the very nature of humanity itself. It redefines the human race. So I want to take this seriously in this episode, not just as a belief, but as a reality. I want to walk through the world that God entered, the way he entered into this world, the incarnation and what it actually means, and also where it leads. Because this doesn't end in a manger. It ends with something that's just as shocking. In Hebrews, it says, he sat down at the right hand of God, the right hand of the majesty on high. So this doesn't end with, when we talk about the incarnation, with the manger scene that Jesus Christ became flesh. It actually ends with a human being standing, or sitting, I should say, at the right hand of God. And this is really what the incarnation does. It redefines the human race, and this is really important. And the gospel writers understood this because they made sure that we clearly understood that Jesus Christ became a human being. I already referenced the fact that John mentions the fact that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and this same Word was God, and it was with God at the very beginning of time. But in the other gospel writers, something really fascinating also happens there right at the very beginning of every single one of these things. Because it doesn't read out like some sort of a mythology that God kind of enters into the world or the human race is magically being created or something like that. It's actually a story that's being anchored into human history. It's being tied to humanity right from the very beginning. It's tied to a geographical region. It's tied to political upheaval that's going on. It's tied to different rulers that live in this era. It's tied to current events that are going on. It's tied to towns and human beings and people that can be recorded. So when this is being put down in the Gospels, it's being anchored into human history. So God doesn't just enter into the human race, willy-nilly. There is a point in human history. It's a verifiable point in fact. It's actually quite daring to do, if you're really trying to craft together a religion and making it out of nothing. Luke anchors it in history. He says, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus is a real ruler. That's a real empire. That's the Roman Empire. That's a real system of belief. That's a real government that was shaping people's lives. And right there, we're reading God enters into it. Not outside the system, not above the system, but he enters right into that system. This is why when Paul writes in Galatians, it says that when the fullness of time came, or really at the right point in human history, is really what that means. God sent his son, born of a woman. It's not random. It's not accidental. It's the fullness of time. God steps into human history at the right moment. And he doesn't step into power. Rather, he steps into something that's actual obscurity. Because when he enters into the human world, he does it in, of all places, Bethlehem. Small, unnoticed, ordinary. Utterly and completely unremarkable. It's not into some major civilization that was, around at that point in time. It's not in some courtly ruler's house or anything like this. Nope, it's Bethlehem. It's Bethlehem that is the little one among the clans of Judah that calls forth the Son of God. God doesn't avoid the small he. In fact, he chooses it. And this is really what we read when we read the Gospels, is that he enters into human history, and then of all things, here is the Son of God living with us, and he's in a feeding trough. Something that's made of stone, it's used, it's ordinary. That's where God rests. Not symbolically, because it's what's there. It's not some symbol meant to mean something important. Rather, it's just what was there and what was available. So let that land a little bit. God becomes a human being, and the first place he is laid is where animals eat. Not in some place that's impressive, not in some place that's elevated. It's in some place that's real. And this is so important. Because not only is he attaching himself to human history, he's attaching himself to a form of human history that the overwhelming majority of human beings can actually relate to. Because here in the 20th century, we look and we think of the idea of somebody being born in a feeding trough, especially in the 20th century, in a developed country like the United States of America. We think of the idea of someone being born in a feeding trough is utterly despicable, the lowest of the low. But the reality is that even right now, the majority of human beings that live on planet Earth are much more attached to that type of an idea than the idea of someone being born in a hospital with doctors and nurses and everybody else surrounding it and medical devices there to make sure that if something goes wrong, everything's going to be taken care of. That there's going to be surgical equipment and there's going to be the ability to do ultrasounds and watch the heartbeat and do all of this. Most of human beings, even in the world today, don't even understand what that is. They don't experience that. Not in third world countries. No. And throughout human history, this is what most human beings would not want to understand. So when Jesus Christ enters into the world, he does it in a way that connects with the overwhelming majority of all humanity. So even though he was in the form of God, as Philippians says, he emptied himself, taking on the form of a human being, a servant, born in the likeness of men. And that's what's so remarkable about him being born in this way, is he really is taking on what most of humanity throughout its history identifies with. He takes on a body. He takes on limitation. He takes on dependence. The early church said of this that what has not been assumed cannot be healed or has not been healed. And that literally means that if God doesn't take on human life fully, then he can't restore it fully. That's why Athanasius of Alexandria writes in his work on the incarnation that he, Christ, was made man, that we, the human race, might be made God. And that begins right here. Not on a cross, but in the incarnation. Irenaeus gives us this really fascinating language for this. He calls it the recapitulation of the human race. That Christ now becomes the true head of humanity. He relives humanity. He reorders humanity. He restores humanity from the inside. And the movement is consistent. It's a downward movement. He humbles himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even a death on the cross. This is what Philippians says of him. He humbles himself. He's moving downward. This is the movement that God is doing toward us. And he's doing it without asking for our permission, without looking for our opinions on it. This is just God acting in this way. And so the manger is this very thing, so is the cross. It's the same direction. It's the same humility because it's the same God. And it doesn't end there. It doesn't end there at all. Because it goes on to a place of redefining the human race in a really even more powerful way, because after the resurrection, Christ is still a human. He's still embodied. So this is where we get to the idea of the ascension, and this is huge, because in Acts it says he was lifted up and a cloud took him out of their sight. In other words, Jesus ascends into heaven. But he doesn't leave humanity behind. He brings it with him, and this is why Hebrews says that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, a human being sitting at the right hand of God in heaven on behalf of all human beings. Let that sink in. Let that land for a moment. This is really what the whole nature of the incarnation is. And this is really quite incredibly fascinating, because right now that means there is a human being in heaven, at the most privileged place in heaven, at the right hand of God the Father. Not distant, but representing. So Christ is now the center of reality. God and humanity are completely united in him. This is what the incarnation is about. And it's not temporarily. It's not even permanently. It's eternally that this is what the human race is now known by. It's known by the finished work of Jesus Christ. It's known by the Christ event. So what does this mean? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for you? Well, first and foremost, I would say your humanity matters. And your life matters. Even if you don't think your humanity and your life matters, it does. Most of us, I think, can probably relate to the psalmist when he says, "What is man that you were mindful of him?" What are we that you would really care for us? But God shows in the person of Jesus Christ, shows in the incarnation that he does not reject humanity. He takes this on. He takes humanity on. And if this is true, that means God has entered human life. He has lived it. He has redeemed it. And he has brought it into heaven. And that means your life, my life, is not outside of God's reach. It's the very place that he has actually already stepped into. And I think that we've made the incarnation much smaller than it actually is. We've turned it into something that we acknowledge. Generally, once a year on Christmas, Jesus in a manger. Instead of acknowledging it as something that we live inside of. Because if this is true, this changes everything for us. That's what the incarnation does. Because it means that God is not distant. It means that God is not abstract. It means that God is not waiting somewhere else for us to finally kind of find our way to him. It means God has entered human life fully and has carried it all the way into heaven. And I might be wrong, but I don't think the problem is that God feels far away. I think the problem that most people have is we keep trying to find God outside of the very humanity that he has taken on. We keep looking all over for him, in all sorts of odd places. And Jesus is very clear. He tells a parable at the very end of his ministry where he says that when welcome into the kingdom. Because when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was sick, you took me in. When I was going through all kinds of difficulty, when I was naked, all of these things, you did these. And the people says, when did we do any of these things to you? And Jesus says, when you did it to the very least of people, you did it to me. He has joined himself to this much. He has already taken humanity on. We look for him in what feels elevated, while ignoring what's real. But the story of the incarnation says God is not found by escaping this life, by escaping your life. God is found because he has already entered into our life. The Word became flesh. He became us. And he never let go of that. God didn't just become a human being. He brought humanity into the life of God. And this is so important to understand, especially at this time of year. Because we just celebrated Easter not that long ago. And it's so easy to remove the events of Easter from the events of Christmas and the incarnation. But when we actually celebrate this time of year, when we actually go through this period of Easter, to not do it truly understanding what the incarnation is means that we don't even really begin to understand what this means. It means that we can't really understand the cross. We can't understand suffering. We can't understand any of this. We can't understand the death, the resurrection, or any of those things. Because when Jesus became human, he fully entered into our humanity. And once you see this, once you see what the scripture is communicating there, you can't unsee it. I don't believe you can. Because once you see this, you begin to understand that this is being communicated to us right from the very beginning of his ministry. He's baptized, and then immediately he goes out and he deals with the tempter. And where Adam and Eve once failed, he destroys the tempter. And then from there on, he continues to do all of these things on behalf of humanity so that the human race will now be defined by him. So when he dies on the cross, he dies as a human being on behalf of all human beings. When he enters into death and he pays that price, he does it as a human being on behalf of all human beings. When God cries out and says, "This is my beloved son," he receives that as a human being on behalf of all human beings. And I know that for a lot of people, they might hear something like that and say, "Well, you can't say that." Well, you know what? I didn't say it first. Paul did first. He says we are heirs and co-heirs with Jesus Christ himself. When God says, "This is my son, and I am pleased with him," he receives this as a human being on behalf of all humanity. When he resurrects from the dead, when he destroys and claims victory over that enemy that lays claim to the human race, he does this as a human being on behalf of all humanity. And when he ascends into heaven, he does it as a human being on behalf of all humanity. And this is what we celebrate during this time of year also. But if you remove the idea of how important the incarnation is and what it actually means for us, then it becomes impossible to even really truly appreciate what it is. Because Jesus Christ is far more than just a way to get to heaven or a way to get back to paradise. And I think one of the biggest problems that I see within Christianity is we just don't seem to understand this. I know it's something that I struggled with for years because I would read through the Bible, and I remember when I was much younger, I would find myself thinking, man, you know what would be wonderful? It would be wonderful if I could go back and I could live the existence of Adam and Eve. Wouldn't it be great if we could have that existence? They walked and they talked in the garden. They were communing with God. And the reality is because of what Jesus Christ has done for me, what he has done for you, actually, what you have right now is far more valuable than that existence that Adam and Eve shared. Because they were never declared to be heirs and co-heirs with Jesus Christ. They were image bearers, but they were not given this identity. It is greater than this. It's not just like bringing the human race back to a sinless state. It's completely redefining the human race. And that's so important because we have the ability to just overlook that. And as a result of it, really kind of in many ways, miss the importance of something like Easter. But we also tend to overlook it. And as a result, we spend our life most easily just looking at our faults, our failings, our shortcomings, and assuming that we're worthless, that we're losers, that there's no hope for us, that God doesn't care about us. And that's why he's not listening, or that's why I'm going through whatever else it is I might go through. But understand, everything about you, everything about me, he took this on. You are not an accident. You're not a mistake. You're not something that's disgusting. You are truly valuable in the eyes of God, and it is so much so that he was willing to send his son, not just to die, but to give you and to give me a completely different identity. And so as we live and we move and we walk around going through our daily lives, we don't do it merely as just broken, screwed up people who don't have anything, worth living for or anything like that. That's not what defines you. What defines you, what gives you value as a human being, is found in the fact that God did this through his son, Jesus Christ. And that's amazing, because that's something that can never be taken away from you. Because the one who declares it sits on the right hand of God. And there is no power in heaven or hell that can undo this work that he has done, or take away your value as a human being. Because it's not tied to your shortcomings, it's not even tied to your successes. It's tied to the fact that you are human. Truly human. And that humanity is something that is utterly priceless, because God, through his son Jesus Christ, has made it to be priceless. Thanks for joining me, and have a great day.